Picture this. Stanford Research Institute, Menlo Park, California, summer of 1974. A windowless room deep inside a research facility. No decorations on the walls, no maps, no photographs, nothing that could provide any kind of visual reference. Just beige paint, fluorescent lights, a table, and 2 chairs. A man sits in one of those chairs. His name is Pat Price. He's 56 years old, heavy-set, balding. The kind of face you'd see behind the counter at a hardware store or coaching Little League baseball. Nothing remarkable about him, nothing that would suggest he's about to do something impossible. Across from him sits a researcher with a clipboard. Between them on the table is a single piece of paper. On that paper, written in neat handwriting, are 2 numbers: 28 degrees, 26 minutes north, 22 degrees, 15 minutes west, geographic coordinates. Nothing else, no context, no explanation. No indication of what might be located at those coordinates, or why anyone would care. Pat Price doesn't know what's at those coordinates. He's never been told. He has no security clearance, no access to classified intelligence, no connection to the military or intelligence community. Until a few months ago, he was the police commissioner of Burbank, California. A cop, a bureaucrat, nobody special. But the CIA thinks he might be very special indeed. Whenever you're ready, the researcher says. Pat Price closes his eyes. For a long moment, nothing happens. The fluorescent lights hum. The air conditioning whispers. The researcher waits, pen poised over his clipboard. And then Pat Price begins to speak. Mountains, he says slowly. I see mountains. High elevation, remote area, very little vegetation. He pauses. His closed eyes move beneath the lids, as if watching something only he can see. There's a facility, built into the rock, underground mostly. I can see an entrance, large doors like a hangar, railroad tracks going inside. The researcher writes furiously, keeping his face neutral, giving nothing away. Inside, Price continues. Caverns, man-made caverns, very large. There's a crane system. Industrial. They're building something big. His brow furrows with concentration. I see spheres, large steel spheres, and pipes, lots of pipes and machinery. It feels like a weapon, something powerful, very secret, very dangerous. He opens his eyes, looks at the researcher. That's what I see, he says simply. The researcher nods, still neutral. Thank you, Mr. Price. That will be all for today. But as Pat Price leaves the room, the researcher's neutral expression cracks. His hands are trembling slightly. Because the coordinates on that piece of paper, 38 degrees, 26 minutes north, 120 degrees, 15 minutes west, point to a location in the mountains of Kazakhstan, Soviet territory. And Pat Price has just described in remarkable detail a top-secret Soviet nuclear research facility at Semipalatinsk, a facility that American spy satellites had only recently discovered, a facility that was one of the most closely guarded secrets in Soviet military infrastructure, a facility that Pat Price, a former police commissioner from Burbank, California, could not possibly have known existed. Underground construction carved into mountains, railroad tracks leading inside, crane systems, large steel spheres consistent with nuclear weapons development. The layout he described matched classified satellite imagery that was accessible to perhaps a few hundred people on Earth, all of them with the highest security clearances. Pat Price had none of those clearances. Pat Price had never seen those satellite images. Pat Price had never been briefed on Soviet nuclear facilities. Pat Price had never even been to that hemisphere. And yet he described the installation as if he were standing inside it. Word of the session traveled up the chain of command. Within days, senior CIA officials were reviewing the transcripts, comparing Price's descriptions to satellite imagery, finding correspondence after correspondence, details he shouldn't have known, layouts he couldn't have seen, information that existed nowhere outside classified files. The implications were staggering. If this was real, if human beings could genuinely perceive distant locations without any physical presence, then the entire framework of intelligence gathering had just been upended. Forget spy satellites and reconnaissance planes. Forget agents risking their lives behind enemy lines. You could just sit someone in a room, give them coordinates, and have them describe what the Soviets were building. The strategic advantage would be incalculable. Of course, if it wasn't real, if this was coincidence, or fraud, or self-deception, then the CIA was wasting time and money on something that belonged in the pages of science fiction. But here's the thing about intelligence agencies in the Cold War. They couldn't afford to ignore any possibility. Not when the stakes were nuclear annihilation, not when the Soviets might be developing the same capabilities. And there were reports, unconfirmed, murky, but persistent, that the Soviets were already researching psychic phenomena, already trying to weaponize the mind, already ahead in a race that most Americans didn't even know existed, the psychic arms race. It sounds absurd. It sounds like something from a bad movie, not from the halls of the Central Intelligence Agency. But for the next 23 years, the United States government would pour approximately $20 million into research programs designed to answer one question: can the human mind perceive things it shouldn't be able to perceive? They called it, eventually, Project Stargate. And what they found, or thought they found, or wanted to find, raises questions about consciousness, about reality, about the nature of perception itself, that we still can't answer today. This is the story of America's psychic spies, the ordinary people who were recruited to do impossible things, the scientists who tried to measure the unmeasurable, the missions that may have saved lives, or may have been elaborate self-deception, the human cost of opening doors in the mind that perhaps should have stayed closed, and the terrifying uncertainty at the heart of it all. After 23 years and millions of dollars and thousands of sessions, we still don't know if any of it was real. Before we descend into this shadow world, I want to ask something. If you believe these hidden chapters of history deserve to be explored, if you want to understand the strange places where government power and the boundaries of human consciousness intersect, you can help by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support allows us to keep investigating the mysteries that official history would prefer stayed buried. Tonight we enter the classified world of America's psychic warfare program. We'll trace the paranoid origins of the psychic arms race, how fear of Soviet mind control research led the CIA to explore territories that science said were impossible. We'll meet the scientists who tried to weaponize consciousness itself, who treated the human mind like an engineering problem, who built protocols and methodologies for something that shouldn't exist. We'll follow the remote viewers themselves, the ordinary men and women who were recruited to see the unseeable, who sat in windowless rooms and described Soviet installations, terrorist hideouts, hostage locations, who claimed to perceive things hundreds or thousands of miles away through nothing but the power of concentration. We'll examine the missions, the hostage rescues, the Soviet secrets, the dark experiments in psychic attack, the successes that still can't be explained, and the failures that call everything into question. We'll witness the psychological destruction. What happens to people who spend years perceiving things humans aren't meant to see? The nightmares, the identity crises, the doors that open in the mind and refuse to close. We'll confront the suspicious deaths and strange endings, the viewers who died young, the program that was terminated and hidden, the files that remain classified even now 30 years after the official end. We'll explore how this real program inspired decades of fiction, how Stranger Things, and The Men Who Stare at Goats, and countless other stories drew from classified reality. And we'll face the question that haunts everything. Did it work? After 23 years and $20 million, did the United States government actually discover a way to perceive beyond the limits of the senses? The answer is more disturbing than a simple yes or no. Because after all that time and money and human cost, we still don't know. Welcome to the Midnight Archives. To understand how the United States government ended up funding psychic research, you have to understand the fear. The year is 1960. The Cold War is at its height. The Soviet Union and the United States are locked in a struggle that both sides believe is existential. Nuclear weapons are pointed at every major city. Spies are everywhere. Each superpower is convinced that the other is developing secret weapons. Secret technologies, secret capabilities that could tip the balance of power. And into this atmosphere of paranoia comes a report. The CIA's sources in the Soviet Union are picking up strange intelligence. The Soviets, it seems, are researching something called psychotronics, the science of the mind, telepathy, clairvoyance, the ability to perceive and influence things at a distance through purely mental means. At first, the American intelligence community dismisses it. Psychic powers, that's superstition, fairy tales. The Soviets are supposed to be scientific materialists. They don't believe in the supernatural, but the reports keep coming. Soviet institutes dedicated to parapsychology research. Scientists with prestigious credentials studying telepathic communication, claims that psychics can read sealed documents, influence electronic equipment, perceive events thousands of miles away. By the late 1960s, the reports have become alarming. A book called Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain is published in the West, describing Soviet research into everything from telepathy to psychokinesis. The authors claim the Soviets are decades ahead in understanding the powers of the human mind. The American intelligence community has a problem. On one hand, this all sounds absurd. Psychic powers aren't real. Every serious scientific study has failed to find evidence for ESP, or telepathy, or any of the other phenomena the Soviets are supposedly researching. On the other hand, what if they're wrong? What if the Soviets have discovered something? What if there's a dimension to human consciousness that Western science has overlooked? What if the next breakthrough in intelligence gathering isn't satellites or computers, but trained psychics who can perceive enemy installations from the comfort of Moscow? The strategic implications are terrifying. If the Soviets can read the minds of American leaders, if they can perceive the locations of nuclear submarines, if they can influence the decisions of generals and politicians through purely mental means, it's probably nonsense, almost certainly nonsense, but probably and almost certainly aren't good enough when nuclear annihilation is on the table. The logic was seductive and dangerous. If the enemy is researching it, there must be something to it. If there's something to it, we need to be ahead. We can't afford a psychic gap any more than we could afford a missile gap. And so, quietly, without public announcement or congressional debate, the American intelligence community began to explore the impossible. The irony, which wouldn't become clear until decades later, is that the Soviet program may have been vastly exaggerated. Many of the reports were propaganda or misunderstandings or wishful thinking by Soviet researchers who wanted funding. The massive advanced psychic research program that American intelligence feared may never have existed in the form they imagined. But the fear was real, and fear in the Cold War opened funding streams that rationality couldn't. In 1972, the CIA approached the Stanford Research Institute in Menlo Park, California. SRI was a prestigious research institution spun off from Stanford University. It had done contract work for the government before. Defense research, advanced technology, the kind of cutting-edge science that the military-industrial complex fed on. The CIA had a proposal. They wanted SRI to investigate whether remote viewing, the alleged ability to perceive distant locations through extrasensory means, was real, and if it was real, whether it could be developed as an intelligence-gathering tool. The scientists who would lead the research were an unlikely pair. Russell Tugga was a physicist specializing in lasers. He'd worked at major corporations, published in respected journals, had all the credentials that mainstream science requires. He was also deeply interested in parapsychology, the scientific study of psychic phenomena. He believed there was something to it, something that conventional science was missing. Hal Puthoff was also a physicist with a background in quantum mechanics and a PhD from Stanford. Like Targ, he had impeccable mainstream credentials. And like Targ, he was fascinated by the possibility that human consciousness could do things that physics said were impossible. Together, they began a research program that would eventually receive multiple code names as it passed between agencies and expanded in scope. Senate, Gondola Wish, Grill Flame, Center Lane, Sunstreak. Finally, in the 1990s, it was consolidated under the name that would become public, Project Stargate. Over the next 23 years, approximately $20 million would flow into this research. Adjusted for inflation, that's over $50 million in today's money. Multiple intelligence agencies would be involved. The CIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, various branches of Army intelligence, dozens of research subjects would be tested, trained, and deployed on actual intelligence missions. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, of viewing sessions would be conducted, targeting everything from Soviet military installations to terrorist hideouts to missing persons. This wasn't a fringe operation run by a few true believers in a basement somewhere. This was institutional, funded by Congress, overseen by senior intelligence officials, given access to some of the most sensitive targeting information in the American intelligence arsenal. The United States government, in other words, took this seriously, very seriously. Whether they should have is another question entirely. The first thing Targ and Puthoff had to do was develop a methodology. If they were going to study psychic perception scientifically, they needed protocols, procedures, repeatable experiments that could generate data. They settled on what they called remote viewing. The concept was simple. A viewer would be given a target, sometimes geographic coordinates, sometimes a sealed envelope containing a photograph, sometimes just a random number assigned to a location. The viewer would then attempt to describe the target using extrasensory perception. The key was isolation. The viewer couldn't know anything about the target through normal means, no photographs, no maps, no hints from the experimenters. The target information was kept sealed until after the viewing session was complete. During a session, the viewer would relax, close their eyes, and attempt to perceive the target location. They'd describe their impressions aloud, shapes, colors, textures, emotions, whatever came to mind. An interviewer would record everything, asking neutral follow-up questions but never confirming or denying anything the viewer said. Afterward, the viewer's descriptions would be compared to actual information about the target. Matches were recorded. Misses were recorded. Statistical analysis would determine whether the hit rate exceeded what you'd expect from random chance. It sounds almost reasonable, scientific even. Take something that's supposedly supernatural and subject it to rigorous testing. Either the viewers can perceive distant targets accurately or they can't. The data will tell you. But here's where it gets complicated. How do you score a remote viewing session? If a viewer says, "I see water," and the target is a location near a lake, is that a hit? What if the lake is 5 miles away? What if there's a drinking fountain in the building? What counts as accurate? The experimenters developed scoring rubrics. Independent judges who didn't know which description matched which target. Statistical methods borrowed from psychology research. But the fundamental problem remained. Human perception is messy. Human description is imprecise. And the process of matching descriptions to targets involves judgment calls that could be influenced, consciously or unconsciously, by what the scorer wanted to find. Believers said the protocols were rigorous. Skeptics said they were riddled with holes. And both were probably right in different ways. What's undeniable is that the methodology represented something unprecedented. The United States government trying to treat the human soul like an engineering problem, trying to measure and quantify and weaponize something that, if it existed at all, seemed to belong more to mysticism than to science. They approached consciousness the way they'd approach radar or satellites. How do we develop it? How do we train it? How do we deploy it? How do we train it? Whether that approach was brilliant or delusional, whether they were pioneers or fools, would take decades to determine, and in some ways we're still not sure. Swan was a New York artist with a striking appearance. Tall, theatrical, with the manner of someone who knew he was the most interesting person in any room. He'd claimed psychic abilities since childhood, visions, premonitions, the sense that he could perceive things beyond the range of normal senses. In the early 1970s, he'd participated in parapsychology experiments at various institutions. His results were intriguing enough that when Targ and Puthoff began their CIA-funded research, Swan was one of the first people they contacted. He would become, in many ways, the architect of remote viewing, as it was practiced in Stargate. It was Swan who developed the coordinate-based protocol, the idea that a viewer could be given nothing but latitude and longitude, and somehow perceive what was at that location. It was Swan who insisted that remote viewing was a trainable skill, not an innate gift that you either had or didn't. It was Swan who created the elaborate methodology that future viewers would be taught. His most famous claimed success came in 1973, before the program had fully ramped up. Swan was given the coordinates of a location and asked to describe what he perceived there. The location turned out to be Jupiter, the planet, not a place on Earth. The experimenters wanted to see if distance mattered, if a viewer could perceive something millions of miles away. Swan described what he saw, and among his descriptions was something unexpected. Rings around Jupiter. At the time, Saturn was the only planet known to have rings. Jupiter's rings hadn't been discovered yet. They wouldn't be confirmed until 1979, when the Voyager 1 spacecraft flew past and photographed them. Believers point to this as extraordinary evidence. Swan described a feature of Jupiter that science didn't know existed. and later observations proved him right. How could he have known unless he actually perceived it? Skeptics have their responses. The descriptions were vague enough to match many things. Scientists had already speculated that Jupiter might have rings. Maybe Swan had read those speculations, or maybe it was coincidence. Make enough predictions and some will come true. The truth is we can't know. We can't go back to 1973 and control all the variables. We can only look at what was recorded and draw our own conclusions. What's certain is that Ingo Swann was absolutely convinced of his abilities. He wrote books, trained other viewers, developed elaborate theories about how remote viewing worked, involving quantum physics and consciousness and higher dimensions. He was either a genuine psychic who helped uncover a hidden aspect of human perception, or a skilled self-promoter who convinced himself and others of something that wasn't real. Maybe he was both. Maybe the line between genuine ability and genuine belief is thinner than we'd like to think. Swan died in 2013, still certain of his gifts, still insisting that the government had discovered something real and then buried it. The truth of what he could or couldn't do went with him. If Ingo Swann was the architect of remote viewing, Pat Price was the prodigy. Price was nothing like the other psychics the program would recruit. He wasn't a mystic or an artist or a believer in the paranormal. He was a cop, a career law enforcement officer who'd worked his way up to police commissioner of Burbank, California. According to Price, he'd discovered his abilities on the job, suspects he shouldn't have been able to find, crimes he seemed to know about before they were reported, intuitions that paid off too often to be coincidence. He didn't call it psychic power. He didn't have a theory about how it worked. He just knew things he shouldn't know, and he'd learned to trust those knowings. When he heard about the research at SRI, he reached out. Ingo Swann had recommended him, and when they tested him, the results were immediate and striking. The semi-Palatinsk viewing, the one we opened with, was just the beginning. In session after session, Price produced descriptions that matched actual targets with disturbing accuracy. Not just general impressions, but specific details, architectural features, equipment layouts, the kinds of things that made intelligence analysts sit up straight. The CIA began giving him operational targets, actual intelligence questions they needed answers to. Not just describe this location exercises, but missions. What are the Soviets building here? Where is this aircraft? What's inside this facility? And Price delivered, or seemed to deliver. His sessions produced information that matched classified intelligence with a consistency that was hard to explain as coincidence. But there was a problem with Pat Price. He was difficult to work with. He had strong opinions about what the program should be doing and how it should be run. He clashed with the experimenters. He believed his abilities were even more powerful than they were willing to credit. And then, in July 1975, he died. Price was in Las Vegas, reportedly meeting with people about business opportunities. He was 57 years old. He was 57 years old, in apparent good health. And one morning, he simply didn't wake up. The official cause of death was heart attack. Just a heart attack, nothing unusual. Men in their 50s have heart attacks all the time. There was no evidence of foul play, no suspicious circumstances, no reason to think it was anything other than natural causes. Except Pat Price was the most talented remote viewer the program had ever found. Except he'd been describing Soviet military installations with accuracy that alarmed the intelligence community. Except there were rumors that the Soviets had their own psychic program and might view American remote viewers as a threat. Except that in a program built on perceiving the impossible, Coincidence feels like an insufficient explanation. The conspiracy theories began almost immediately. The Soviets had assassinated him using their own psychic weapons, stopping his heart from a distance. Or the CIA had silenced him because he knew too much, had seen too much, had become a liability. Or some other shadow agency had eliminated a capability they couldn't afford to let exist. There's no evidence for any of this. Pat Price probably just had a heart attack. Men his age, with his build, under the stress of the work he was doing, it happens. But we'll never know for certain. And in a program defined by uncertainty, the mystery of Pat Price's death fits perfectly. He was the best they ever had. And then he was gone. If there's one remote viewer whose story is best documented, whose work was most extensively tested, whose contributions to the program span the longest period, it's Joseph McMoneagle. McMoneagle was a soldier, a chief warrant officer in the United States Army, a Vietnam veteran with combat experience and multiple decorations, not the kind of person you'd expect to find in a psychic research program. His abilities, according to his own account, emerged after a near-death experience in 1970. While stationed in Germany, he suffered a severe illness that caused his heart to stop. In those moments of clinical death, he reported experiences that would be familiar to anyone who's read about NDES, the tunnel, the light, the sense of leaving his body. When he recovered, something had changed. He began having perceptions that seemed to come from beyond his normal senses, knowing things he shouldn't know, sensing events before they happened, the kind of experiences that he'd previously dismissed as superstition. In 1978, McMoneagle was recruited into what was then called Grill Flame, one of the predecessor programs to Stargate. And for the next 17 years, until the program's termination in 1995, he was one of its most active viewers. The military kept statistics on his work. Over the course of his career in the program, he participated in hundreds of remote viewing sessions. His targets ranged from Soviet military installations to terrorist hideouts to missing persons. And according to the military's own assessment, he was good. McMoneagle's most famous claimed success involved a Soviet submarine. In the early 1980s, he was given coordinates and asked to describe what was there. He described what sounded like a massive submarine construction facility. He sketched what he perceived, an enormous submarine, far larger than anything in the existing Soviet fleet, with unusual design features. Months later, satellite imagery confirmed the existence of the Typhoon-class submarine, the largest submarine ever built under construction at the exact facility McMoneagle had described. Features he'd drawn matched the actual design, coincidence, or genuine perception. The military was impressed enough that McMoneagle received the Legion of Merit, one of the highest military honors, for his contribution to intelligence operations. The award citation explicitly acknowledged his work as a remote viewer. This is remarkable. The United States military gave a commendation to a man for psychic abilities. Whatever you believe about whether remote viewing is real, the fact that the military believed it enough to issue medals should tell you how seriously they took the program. But Joe McMoneagle's story isn't just about successes, it's also about what the work cost him. In interviews and books, McMoneagle has been open about the psychological burden of remote viewing. When you're trained to perceive distant locations, you don't get to choose what you see. The program sent him looking for hostages, and sometimes he perceived their suffering. They sent him looking for military installations, and sometimes he saw what those installations were designed to do. You can't unsee things. You can't unfeel the impressions that come through in a viewing session, and the program offered little in the way of psychological support. This was the military. You didn't complain about stress. You didn't ask for counseling. You did your job. McMonigal has spoken about nightmares, about difficulty separating visions from reality, about the lingering weight of all the dark places he'd looked into over the years. Whether or not remote viewing is real, the psychological impact on the people who practiced it was very real indeed. The public story of Project Stargate is largely a story of men. Ingo Swann, Pat Price, Joe McMonigal. These are the names that appear in the books and documentaries. But the program included female remote viewers whose contributions have often been overlooked. Angela de la Fiora Ford was one of the most accurate viewers in the program's history. Her sessions produced hits that matched or exceeded those of her male colleagues. She worked on some of the most sensitive operational targets, actual intelligence missions, not just research exercises. Yet her name appears far less frequently in accounts of the program. Her story is less told. Her contributions less celebrated. There were others. Gabrielle Pettingell, viewers whose names remain less prominent in the historical record. Women who sat in the same windowless rooms, performed the same impossible task, and received less recognition. Some researchers noted that female viewers seemed to approach remote viewing differently than men. Different types of impressions, different patterns of hits and misses. Whether this reflected genuine differences in psychic perception or just different cognitive styles is impossible to know. What's clear is that the gender dynamics of a military-adjacent program in the 1970s and 80s shaped how these women's contributions were recorded, valued, and remembered. A program that was already marginalized, psychic research in the intelligence community had its own internal hierarchies of credibility. The full story of the women of Stargate remains to be written. Their experiences, their observations, their analysis of what they perceived, much of this has been lost or overlooked. Another gap in a record that's already full of gaps. Here's something that doesn't appear much in the official documentation. What did it do to people to spend years trying to perceive the unseeable? The remote viewers who've spoken publicly describe a range of disturbing after effects. The difficulty of turning it off. Once you've trained yourself to be open to extrasensory impressions, how do you close that door? Some viewers reported perceiving things involuntarily, picking up on locations or events without meaning to, without wanting to, lying in bed at night and suddenly seeing images of places they'd never been, sensing things about strangers on the street. Nightmares were common, especially among viewers who'd worked on dark targets, hostage situations, crime scenes, sites of violence and suffering. Those impressions stayed with them, came back when they slept, intruded on their waking lives. Several viewers described something they called psychic contamination, the sense that perceiving certain locations or events had left a residue on their consciousness. That something of what they'd seen had attached itself to them. There's no scientific framework for this. Either it's a genuine phenomenon, a real psychological consequence of extended extrasensory perception, or it's the human mind's way of processing the strain of years spent doing something cognitively unusual. Either way, the suffering was real. The program offered little in the way of psychological support. This was intelligence work, military work. You didn't talk about your feelings. You didn't admit to struggling. You did the job and dealt with the consequences on your own time. Some viewers coped well, integrated their experiences, built successful second careers as authors or consultants or teachers in the psychic community. Others struggled, depression, anxiety, identity crises, the sense of having spent years on something the world dismissed as nonsense, while also genuinely believing they'd touched something real. whether they were psychic or deluded, and we may never know which, they were used. They were deployed on missions, asked to perform an impossible task over and over, and then, when the program ended, they were discarded. The pattern is familiar. Government programs use people for classified purposes. The program ends. The people are left to cope on their own. The psychological toll of Project Stargate may be less visible than the physical toll of other government experiments, but it was no less real. Remote viewing was never just research. From early in the program, the intelligence community wanted operational results. They wanted to use these psychics to find things, to answer questions, to provide intelligence that satellites and spies couldn't access. The hostage situations began almost as soon as the program was established. November 1979. Iranian revolutionaries stormed the American embassy in Tehran 5-2. American diplomats and citizens are taken hostage. The crisis will last 444 days and define a presidency. From the beginning, American intelligence was desperate for information. Where were the hostages being held? What were the conditions? What were the captors planning? Satellites couldn't see inside buildings. Human intelligence sources inside Iran were limited. The hostages had simply disappeared into the vastness of Tehran. And so, amid all the other intelligence-gathering efforts, the Stargate program was given a mission: find the hostages. Remote viewers were pulled into sessions, given target coordinates, asked to describe what they perceived. The results were mixed. Some sessions produced descriptions that seemed to match known locations. A viewer might describe a building with certain architectural features, certain room layouts, certain conditions, and investigators would find that it corresponded to a location where hostages were thought to be held. Other sessions produced information that led nowhere, descriptions of places that couldn't be found, layouts that didn't match anything. Did the remote viewing help? Did any of the intelligence generated actually contribute to rescue planning or hostage welfare? The official answer is inconclusive. The information was considered along with other intelligence. Whether it was actually useful, whether it led to any actionable decisions, remains unclear. But the hostage missions established a pattern. Whenever the government was desperate, whenever conventional intelligence had failed, someone would suggest trying the psychics. The Dozier kidnapping in 1981, Brigadier General James Dozier, the highest-ranking American officer in NATO's Southern European Command, was kidnapped by the Italian Red Brigades. For 42 days, Italian police and American intelligence desperately searched for his location. Stargate viewers were tasked. They provided descriptions, sketches, impressions. When Dozier was finally rescued by Italian special forces, some claimed that psychic intelligence had contributed. The official Italian position denied any such involvement. The truth is probably lost to the classified record. Throughout the 1980s, similar missions continued. American hostages in Beirut, journalists, diplomats, intelligence officers, kidnapped by Lebanese factions and held for years. Remote viewers were repeatedly asked to find them. Sometimes they seemed to produce accurate information. Sometimes they produced nothing useful. The hit rate was better than chance, according to program managers. It was confirmation bias, according to critics. The ethical dimension is rarely discussed. When you tell a hostage's family that you're trying everything, when you bring in psychics to locate their loved one, you're offering hope. And when the information proves wrong, or leads nowhere, or the hostage dies despite your efforts, what have you given them except false comfort? The desperation that led intelligence agencies to try remote viewing is understandable. When lives are at stake, you try anything, but anything includes methods that may not work, and the cost of false hope can be measured in human suffering. The primary mission of Project Stargate throughout its existence was intelligence gathering against the Soviet Union. This made strategic sense. If remote viewing worked, it represented a capability that could penetrate any security. No walls could stop it. No guards could prevent it. No classification could hide information from a mind that could perceive across continents. The viewers were given coordinates all over the Soviet Union. Nuclear facilities, submarine bases, research laboratories, underground bunkers, the full catalog of Soviet military infrastructure became a target list for psychic perception. The Pat Price sessions at Semipalatinsk were just the beginning. Over the years, viewers described dozens of Soviet installations. They sketched layouts of secret facilities. They reported on construction projects and equipment and personnel. The intelligence community found some of this information verified by other sources. Satellite imagery that matched viewer sketches. Technical intelligence that confirmed descriptions of equipment. The correspondences were often close enough to be troubling for those who didn't believe remote viewing was possible. But the verification problem was never solved. When a viewer described a Soviet facility accurately, what did that prove? Maybe they genuinely perceived it through extrasensory means. Or maybe they'd unconsciously absorbed information from briefings, from news reports, from the cultural osmosis of living in a society obsessed with Soviet military power. When a viewer described a facility inaccurately, what did that prove? Maybe remote viewing didn't work, or didn't work reliably, or maybe the viewer had an off day, perceived the target wrong, made the kind of errors that any intelligence source makes. The statistical arguments were endless. Believers crunched numbers showing hit rates that exceeded chance. Skeptics pointed to methodological problems that inflated those rates. Both sides were arguing in good faith, largely. They just couldn't agree on what the data meant. What's certain is that the program generated volumes of intelligence reporting, reports that were circulated within the intelligence community, reports that were taken seriously enough to influence assessments, at least sometimes, times. Whether any of it was actually psychic perception or just elaborate pattern matching by intelligent humans who'd absorbed a lot of information about Soviet military programs, we may never know. Beyond hostages and Soviet secrets, the program took on a range of other finding missions. Missing aircraft, crashed satellites, downed helicopters, the debris of aerospace technology scattered across remote locations, needing to be recovered before adversaries could find it. When Skylab fell in 1979, remote viewers were reportedly asked to locate significant debris. Their impressions were compared to the actual impact zones in Australia. When military aircraft went down in hostile or inaccessible territory, viewers were sometimes tasked with finding them, most painfully, missing persons. American MYAs from Vietnam, service members whose fates were unknown decades after the war ended, families desperate for any information about what had happened to their loved ones. The program received requests to locate missing POWs to determine whether Americans were still being held in Southeast Asia, to provide information that could bring closure to families that had waited years for answers. Some viewers claimed to perceive American prisoners still alive in Vietnam or Laos, still held in captivity, still waiting for rescue. These claims raised impossible questions. People, if a psychic sees a POW alive in a camp, what do you do with that information? Launch a rescue mission based on extrasensory perception. Tell the family their son might still be alive based on nothing more than a viewing session. The cruelty of false hope cut both ways. Hope that was true but unprovable. Hope that was false but earnestly believed. and families caught in between, wanting to believe, afraid to believe, trapped in uncertainty. Most of the POW viewing sessions led nowhere. No rescue missions were launched based on psychic intelligence. The families were not given information that would resolve their uncertainty, reality. Whether that was because the information wasn't accurate, or because the government wasn't willing to act on psychic data, or because the situation was more complicated than anyone admitted, we don't know. Another gap in the record. Every program remembers its successes. Stargate was no exception. The semi-Palatinsk hit, the Typhoon submarine description, sessions where viewers seemed to describe targets with impossible accuracy. These became the stories that were told and retold, that appeared in briefings and books and documentaries. But for every success, there were failures. Sessions where viewers described locations that didn't exist, detailed drawings of facilities that couldn't be found anywhere on Earth, confident assertions that proved completely wrong, operational missions that led nowhere, hostage locations that turned out to be empty buildings, intelligence assessments based on viewing data that was contradicted by subsequent evidence. The program kept statistics after a fashion, hit rates, accuracy assessments. But there's a fundamental problem with how humans process evidence. We remember hits and forget misses. If a viewer describes 10 targets and gets one dramatically right, that one becomes the story. The 9 failures fade from memory. Over time, the program looks more successful than it was. This isn't dishonesty necessarily. It's just how human memory works, how institutions work, how narratives get constructed. Skeptics argued that when you account for all the sessions, not just the cherry-picked successes, the hit rate was barely above chance, maybe slightly above, depending on how you measured, but not the consistent, reliable accuracy you'd need for operational intelligence. Believers argued that even a slight edge above chance was significant, that even occasional, accurate sessions had value, that the failures didn't disprove the reality of the successes. The debate never resolved. The data was ambiguous enough to support either conclusion, and that ambiguity, that inability to know for certain, is perhaps the most unsettling thing about the whole program. Remote viewing was passive. You looked at a target, you described what you perceived. You didn't interact with it, didn't change it, didn't affect it. At least that was the theory. But the program explored other possibilities. Active applications, offensive uses. Could a trained psychic influence events at a distance? Could they interfere with electronic equipment? Could they affect the minds of adversaries? The experiments in this area are less well documented than the remote viewing research, but they happened at Fort Bragg in a program sometimes called the Jedi Project. Though that may have been informal nomenclature, soldiers were trained in various consciousness techniques. Meditation, martial arts with a psychic component, attempts to influence physical reality through mental concentration. The goat staring experiments actually happened. Soldiers attempting to stop the hearts of goats through the power of concentration alone, trying to kill with thought. It sounds absurd. It sounds like satire. When John Ronson wrote about it in The Men Who Stare at Goats, the absurdity was played for comedy. But real soldiers participated. Real goats were involved. Real government money funded it. Whether any goats actually died from psychic attack is unclear. The evidence suggests no, the experiments failed. But the attempt was made. Other applications were explored. Psychic interrogation, attempting to read the minds of prisoners. Remote influence, trying to affect the decisions of distant targets. Defense applications, training soldiers to resist psychic attack. Little of this is well documented in declassified records. The more extreme the application, the more likely it remained classified, or was never written down in the first place, but the intention was clear. If the mind could perceive across distances, maybe it could act across distances too. And if it could act across distances, then consciousness itself became a weapon. The implications were terrifying if true. They were also ridiculous if false. And we still don't know which. The scientists who ran the program at Stanford Research Institute were not charlatans. They had genuine credentials, genuine publications, genuine standing in the scientific community, at least before they got involved with psychic research. Russell Targ had worked on laser technology at major corporations. Hal Puthoff had a PhD from Stanford and had done work in quantum physics. They brought scientific methodology, or what they believed was scientific methodology, to the study of the paranormal. But they were also believers. From the beginning, Targ and Puthoff were convinced that there was something real to psychic phenomena. They'd had experiences themselves. They'd seen results in early experiments that convinced them remote viewing was genuine. This created a tension at the heart of the program. Science is supposed to be objective. You're supposed to follow the evidence wherever it leads. You're not supposed to have a preferred outcome that you're hoping the data will support. But when you already believe something, it's very hard to evaluate evidence objectively. Every hit confirms what you already know. Every miss is an anomaly, an off day, a technical glitch. Your belief filters the evidence, emphasizing what supports it and dismissing what contradicts it. Critics accuse Targ and Puthoff of exactly this, of designing experiments that allowed for multiple interpretations, of scoring sessions in ways that inflated hit rates, of ignoring failures and celebrating successes. The criticism wasn't always fair. The experimenters did try to implement controls. They did use double-blind protocols. They did subject their data to statistical analysis. But they were human. And humans are not good at objectively evaluating evidence for things they desperately want to believe. After the program ended, both men continued to advocate for remote viewing. They wrote books, gave lectures, trained new generations of would-be psychics. Their conviction never wavered. They may have been right. There may be something to remote viewing. And Targ and Puthoff may have been pioneers who faced unjust skepticism. Or they may have been intelligent men who fooled themselves, who wanted so badly to prove the existence of psychic abilities that they couldn't see the flaws in their own work. Where there are believers, there are skeptics. The experimental protocols had holes. A skilled cold reader, someone trained in the art of making vague statements seem specific, could produce the kinds of hits that the program was celebrating. Sensory leakage, subtle cues from the experimenters, could provide information that viewers seemed to perceive psychically. Randy offered a standing prize of $1 million to anyone who could demonstrate genuine psychic ability under controlled conditions. Not no remote viewer ever collected. The believers had responses to this. The prize conditions were too restrictive. The skeptical atmosphere inhibited psychic function. The best remote viewers weren't interested in proving themselves to debunkers. Ray Hyman, a psychologist who reviewed the Stargate data for the government, was more measured than Randy, but equally skeptical. He found methodological problems throughout the research. Selection effects, choosing which sessions to analyze based on results, scoring inconsistencies, different standards applied to different sessions, insufficient controls for sensory cues, and experimenter bias. Hyman didn't claim the remote viewers were fraudulent. He thought they probably believed in their abilities. But he also thought the evidence for those abilities was far weaker than the believers admitted. The 1995 AIR report, the American Institutes for Research evaluation that effectively ended the program, split the difference. Statistician Jessica Utz found that the hit rates in some studies were statistically significant. Something seemed to be happening that was hard to explain by chance alone. But Hyman, reviewing the same data, found the evidence unconvincing. The effects were small, the methodology was problematic, and even if something was happening, it wasn't clear it was useful for intelligence purposes. The conclusion, remote viewing might be real in some limited sense, but it wasn't operationally valuable. The program should be terminated. And so it was. The fundamental problem is epistemological. What would proof of psychic ability even look like? If a remote viewer describes a target accurately, skeptics can always find an alternative explanation. Lucky guess. Unconscious inference from available information. Methodological flaws that allowed leakage. The standards for proof keep shifting upward. If a remote viewer fails, believers can always find an excuse. Off day. Hostile conditions. Interference from skeptical energy. The standards for disproof keep shifting upward. The data from Stargate is genuinely ambiguous. You can look at the same sessions, the same statistics, and reach opposite conclusions depending on your prior beliefs. Believers see a pattern of hits that exceeds chance. They see operational successes that conventional explanation can't account for. They see something real struggling to emerge through the noise of imperfect methodology. Skeptics see confirmation bias and methodological flaws. They see humans doing what humans always do, finding patterns, remembering successes, explaining away failures. Self-deception on an institutional scale. Both perspectives are internally consistent. Both account for the evidence. Neither can definitively prove the other wrong. That's the horror of it in a way. After 23 years and 20 million and thousands of sessions, we still can't say for certain whether remote viewing is real. The question remains open, may remain open forever, and we have to live with that uncertainty. One thing is certain, the classification of the program made scientific evaluation nearly impossible. In normal science, research is published. Other scientists replicate it, criticize it, build on it. This process of peer review is messy and imperfect, but it works. Bad research gets caught. Good research gets confirmed. The Stargate program couldn't participate in this process. The research was classified. The methods were secret. Outside scientists couldn't examine the data, couldn't attempt replication, couldn't probe the methodology for weaknesses. The program existed in a bubble. The same people who believed in remote viewing designed the experiments, ran the sessions, evaluated the results, and reported to their funders. There was no external check on their conclusions. This is a recipe for self-deception, not deliberate fraud. The researchers were probably sincere, but humans fool themselves. They see what they expect to see. They interpret ambiguous evidence in ways that confirm their hopes. In a classified program without external review, there's nothing to catch these errors. The bubble reinforces itself. It's possible that remote viewing is real, and the Stargate researchers were genuine pioneers who would have been vindicated if the scientific community had given them a fair hearing. It's also possible that remote viewing is an illusion, and the Stargate researchers were sincere but deluded people who convinced themselves of something false and never had their errors corrected because no one from outside could check their work. We can't know which. The conditions of the program prevented the kind of scrutiny that could have resolved the question, and that's a damning indictment regardless of whether remote viewing is real. By the late 1980s, the program was showing strain. The Cold War was ending. The Soviet threat that had justified so much spending was dissolving. Budget pressures were mounting across the intelligence community, and programs had to prove their value or face cuts. Stargate struggled to prove its value. The operational successes were real, or claimed to be real, but they were hard to quantify. How do you measure the value of a psychic impression that might or might not have contributed to an intelligence assessment? How do you justify continued funding based on hits that skeptics could attribute to chance? A new generation of military and intelligence officers was rising through the ranks. They hadn't been present for their early enthusiasm. They hadn't seen the sessions that had convinced the original supporters. To them, psychic research looked like a relic from a different era, a Cold War excess that no longer made sense. The remote viewers sensed the shift. Fewer urgent tasking requests, more administrative paperwork, less enthusiasm from the brass. Joe McMoneagle has described the feeling of watching the program slowly die. Years of work, years of perceived successes, and then the gradual realization that none of it mattered. The institution had moved on. The believers never stopped believing. The viewers never stopped perceiving or believing they perceived. But the support structure was crumbling around them. When the end came in 1995, it wasn't a surprise to anyone who'd been paying attention. The program had been dying for years. In 1995, the CIA finally commissioned an external review. The American Institute for Research was hired to evaluate the program's entire history, all the data, all the sessions, everything that had accumulated over more than 2 decades. The review produced a split verdict. Jessica Utz, a statistician, found statistical evidence that something was happening. The hit rates in certain studies exceeded what you'd expect from chance alone. Some effect appeared to be real. Ray Hyman, a psychologist, was unconvinced. The methodology was too flawed to draw conclusions. The effects were too small to be useful. Whatever was happening, if anything was happening, wasn't valuable for intelligence purposes. The bottom line, no compelling evidence of operational value. The program was terminated. And then something unusual happened. The files were declassified. Not all of them. Some documents remain classified to this day for reasons that have never been fully explained. Happened. But thousands of pages were released. The existence of the program became public knowledge. Journalists wrote stories. Researchers began to analyze what had actually happened behind the classified walls. The reaction was complicated. Some people were fascinated. Evidence that the government had taken psychic research seriously. Validation for those who'd always believed in the paranormal. Others were appalled. Millions spent on this. Intelligence agencies pursuing magic and superstition, and many were simply puzzled. The evidence didn't prove remote viewing was real, but it didn't definitively prove it wasn't either. The program had ended, but the questions it raised remained open. When the program ended, the remote viewers were left to fend for themselves. There's no pension for psychic work, no transition assistance for people whose job was perceiving distant locations through extrasensory means. The skills they'd developed, real or imagined, had no market value in the civilian world. Some viewers leveraged their experience into new careers. Joe McMoneagle became something of a celebrity in the psychic community. He wrote books about his experiences, appeared on television programs, taught remote viewing courses. His Legion of Merit gave him a credibility that other psychics couldn't claim. Ingo Swann, until his death in 2013, continued writing and teaching. His books on remote viewing methodology remain influential among those who practiced the technique. Others became consultants, trainers, speakers on the alternative lecture circuit. The New Age community welcomed them. There was an audience hungry to learn from genuine government psychics, but not everyone landed on their feet. Some viewers struggled with the transition, years spent doing classified work for the government, and then nothing, nothing, nothing. No acknowledgement, no gratitude, no recognition that their service had been real, had mattered. The psychological burden of the work didn't disappear when the program ended. The nightmares, the intrusive perceptions, the sense of having touched something that most people couldn't understand, all of it remained, long after the windowless rooms and the coordinate targets were gone. Mental health support was limited. The program had never prioritized psychological care, and after termination, there was even less. Former viewers were on their own, processing experiences that didn't fit into any normal therapeutic framework. Whether their abilities were real or imagined, their suffering was real. And then there are the mysteries. Pat Price, dead of a heart attack in 1975, probably natural causes, possibly something else. Other viewers with health problems, with early deaths, with strange circumstances that might mean nothing, or might mean something. This is where the story threatens to slide into conspiracy theory. And I want to be careful here. There's no evidence that remote viewers were assassinated. No evidence of a cover-up or a silencing campaign. The deaths can all be explained by normal causes, the kind of health problems that anyone might have, especially people under the stress of classified work. But this was a program about the impossible, a program where the normal rules of perception didn't apply, a program where people claimed to see things they shouldn't be able to see. In that context, coincidence feels insufficient. When Pat Price, the best viewer the program ever had, dies suddenly at 57, right after producing intelligence that alarmed the intelligence community, the mind searches for connection, for meaning. That's human nature. We look for patterns, we construct narratives, we resist the idea that things just happen randomly, meaninglessly. The truth is probably boring. Heart attacks happen, cancer happens, life is fragile, and the human body fails in ordinary ways for ordinary reasons. But we'll never know for certain, and in a program defined by uncertainty, the ambiguity is itself a kind of horror. The declassified files are incomplete. Some documents remain classified even now, 3 decades after the program's termination. No explanation has been given for why. National security concerns, embarrassing details, information that would contradict the official narrative. We can only guess. The files that were released tell a partial story. They show some of the sessions, some of the targets, some of the results. But there are gaps, references to subprograms that aren't otherwise documented, mentions of operations that don't appear elsewhere in the record. The international dimension is almost entirely opaque. There are hints that allied nations had similar programs, that intelligence was shared, that cooperation occurred, but the details are missing. What else happened under the Stargate umbrella? What other applications were explored? What experiments were conducted that never made it into the declassified record? We don't know, may never know. The full scope of the program, its successes, its failures, its extremes, is probably lost forever, buried in still classified files, or destroyed entirely. This is the question that matters most, and it's the question we can't answer. After 23 years and 20 million, did the United States government discover a way to perceive beyond the limits of normal senses? The honest answer, we don't know. The statistical evidence is ambiguous. Some studies showed hit rates above chance. Others showed nothing significant. The methodology was flawed enough that both interpretations are defensible. The operational evidence is even murkier. Claims of success, the semi-Palatinsk viewing, the Typhoon submarine, are impressive, but not conclusive. Alternative explanations exist. Confirmation bias was rampant. Individual viewers remained convinced their abilities were real. They experienced something, perceptions that seemed to come from outside normal channels, information that arrived without conventional explanation. Whether those experiences represented genuine extrasensory perception or something else entirely, they felt real to the people who had them. The skeptics are equally convinced. They see self-deception and methodological failure. They see human beings doing what human beings always do, finding patterns, believing stories, convincing themselves of things that aren't true. Both sides have evidence. Neither side can prove the other wrong. After everything, after all the sessions and missions and millions of dollars, we're left with uncertainty, and that uncertainty is itself a kind of horror. We spent 23 years asking whether consciousness can transcend its physical limits, and the universe refused to give us a clear answer. One thing is certain, the classification of the program made scientific evaluation nearly impossible. In normal science, research is published. Other scientists replicate it, criticize it, build on it. This process of peer review is messy and imperfect, but it works. Bad research gets caught. Good research gets confirmed. The Stargate program couldn't participate in this process. The research was classified. The methods were secret. Outside scientists couldn't examine the data, couldn't attempt replication, couldn't probe the methodology for weaknesses. The program existed in a bubble. The same people who believed in remote viewing designed the experiments, ran the sessions, evaluated the results, and reported to their funders. There was no external check on their conclusions. This is a recipe for self-deception, not deliberate fraud. The researchers were probably sincere, but humans fool themselves. They see what they expect to see. They interpret ambiguous evidence in ways that confirm their hopes. In a classified program without external review, there's nothing to catch these errors. The bubble reinforces itself. It's possible that remote viewing is real, and the Stargate researchers were genuine pioneers who would have been vindicated if the scientific community had given them a fair hearing. It's also possible that remote viewing is an illusion, and the Stargate researchers were sincere but deluded people who convinced themselves of something false and never had their errors corrected because no one from outside could check their work. We can't know which. The conditions of the program prevented the kind of scrutiny that could have resolved the question, and that's a damning indictment regardless of whether remote viewing is real. By the late 1980s, the program was showing strain. The Cold War was ending. The Soviet threat that had justified so much spending was dissolving. Budget pressures were mounting across the intelligence community, and programs had to prove their value or face cuts. Stargate struggled to prove its value. The operational successes were real, or claimed to be real, but they were hard to quantify. How do you measure the value of a psychic impression that might or might not have contributed to an intelligence assessment? How do you justify continued funding based on hits that skeptics could attribute to chance? A new generation of military and intelligence officers was rising through the ranks. They hadn't been present for their early enthusiasm. They hadn't seen the sessions that had convinced the original supporters. To them, psychic research looked like a relic from a different era. A Cold War excess that no longer made sense. The remote viewers sensed the shift, fewer urgent tasking requests, more administrative paperwork, less enthusiasm from the brass. Joe McMoneagle has described the feeling of watching the program slowly die. Years of work, years of perceived successes, and then the gradual realization that none of it mattered. The institution had moved on. The believers never stopped believing. The viewers never stopped perceiving or believing they perceived. But the support structure was crumbling around them. When the end came in 1995, it wasn't a surprise to anyone who'd been paying attention. The program had been dying for years. In 1995, the CIA finally commissioned an external review. The American Institute for Research was hired to evaluate the program's entire history, all the data, all the sessions, everything that had accumulated over more than 2 decades. The review produced a split verdict. Jessica Utz, a statistician, found statistical evidence that something was happening. The hit rates in certain studies exceeded what you'd expect from chance alone. Some effect appeared to be real. Ray Hyman, a psychologist, was unconvinced. The methodology was too flawed to draw conclusions. The effects were too small to be useful. Whatever was happening, if anything was happening, wasn't valuable for intelligence purposes. The bottom line, no compelling evidence of operational value. The program was terminated, and then something unusual happened. The files were declassified, not all of them. Some documents remain classified to this day for reasons that have never been fully explained. Happened. But thousands of pages were released. The existence of the program became public knowledge. Journalists wrote stories. Researchers began to analyze what had actually happened behind the classified walls. The reaction was complicated. Some people were fascinated. Evidence that the government had taken psychic research seriously. Validation for those who'd always believed in the paranormal. Others were appalled. 20 million spent on this. Intelligence agencies pursuing magic and superstition. And many were simply puzzled. The evidence didn't prove remote viewing was real, but it didn't definitively prove it wasn't either. The program had ended, but the questions it raised remained open. One of the strangest legacies of Project Stargate is how thoroughly it's been absorbed into popular culture. The real program, classified, ambiguous, never definitively proven or disproven, has become the template for countless fictional treatments. Stranger Things, the Netflix phenomenon, draws directly from this well. The character of Eleven was raised in a government laboratory, trained to use psychic abilities for military purposes. She practices remote viewing, perceiving distant locations through sensory deprivation tanks that were actually used in real Stargate research. The show's Hawkins Laboratory is a fictional composite of real facilities. Dr. Brenner is a sanitized version of the scientist who ran programs like these. The entire premise, government developing psychic children as weapons, is fiction built on a foundation of documented history. The difference, of course, is that 11 gets powers, real powers. She can move objects, attack enemies, protect her friends. She becomes a superhero. The real subjects of Project Stargate got no such gifts. They claimed to perceive distant locations, not to influence them. And even that claim remains unverified. Fiction gives us the fantasy we want. Heroes with powers, villains who face consequences, resolution, reality, gives us ambiguity and abandonment. The Men Who Stare at Goats, John Ronson's book and the subsequent film, took a different approach. It played the material for comedy. George Clooney and Jeff Bridges running through the absurdities of military psychic research, soldiers trying to kill goats with their minds, New Age philosophy meeting special operations. The movie is funny. The real program was also funny in a dark way. The idea that the United States military was training soldiers to stop hearts through concentration is objectively absurd. But real soldiers participated. Real goats were used. Real government money was spent. Movies like Suspect Zero, featuring FBI agents using remote viewing to catch serial killers. Video games and novels and television series, all drawing from the same well. Project Stargate became a genre. The classified reality dissolved into cultural mythology, and maybe that's the final fate of things we can't understand. They become stories, they become entertainment. The uncertainty is resolved into narrative. The ambiguity smoothed into plot. The real program asked questions we couldn't answer. Fiction gives us the answers we want to hear. Let's step back and consider what this all means. The United States government spent 23 years and 20 million trying to determine whether human consciousness can perceive beyond the limits of physical senses. If the answer is yes, if remote viewing is real, then the implications are staggering. Privacy becomes impossible. Any location, any secret, any hidden thing can be perceived by a trained mind. The walls we build around ourselves, physical, political, psychological, are illusions. Nothing is truly hidden. The nature of consciousness itself becomes mysterious in new ways. How does awareness transcend space? What is the mind? That it can reach across continents. Every assumption we have about the relationship between brain and perception has to be reconsidered. And if powers like this can be developed, trained, weaponized, then consciousness itself becomes a domain of conflict. The mind becomes a battlefield. The innermost recesses of thought become vulnerable to observation. That's terrifying. But if the answer is no, if remote viewing is illusion, self-deception, confirmation bias elevated to institutional policy, then a different kind of horror emerges. It means our intelligence agencies, our military, our government, are capable of profound self-deception. It means smart, educated, well-intentioned people can convince themselves of something false and pursue it for decades without ever recognizing their error. It means we can't trust our institutions to accurately assess reality. If they can spend 23 years on psychic research without reaching a conclusion, what else might they be wrong about? It means the human capacity for belief, the way we see what we want to see and dismiss what we don't, runs deeper than we'd like to admit. That's terrifying too. Either answer is disturbing, and the fact that we don't know the answer, that after everything, the question remains open, may be most disturbing of all. We live in uncertainty. We make decisions based on incomplete information, on beliefs we can't verify, on institutions whose competence we can't assess. Project Stargate is a mirror. It shows us the limits of what we can know, and those limits are closer than we'd like to think. The story doesn't end in 1995. In recent years, the Pentagon has shown renewed interest in anomalous phenomena. The Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, AATI-TIP, studied UFO sightings and included researchers with connections to similar consciousness research. The program ran for years before its existence became public. Other programs remain classified. We know they exist only from budget documents and occasional leaks. What they're studying, what they've found, whether consciousness research continues under different names, we don't know. Private companies have picked up where government left off. Silicon Valley is investing in consciousness research, neuroscience, and technology, and speculation about extended human capabilities. The questions that drove Stargate haven't gone away. They've just found new patrons. Former remote viewers continue to teach. The techniques developed at Stanford Research Institute are now available to anyone with an internet connection and a willingness to practice. Whether they work, whether the general public can develop the abilities the program claimed, is tested every day by thousands of amateur psychics. The search never ended. It just went underground, went private, went decentralized. Somewhere, right now, someone is sitting in a quiet room with their eyes closed, trying to perceive a distant location through nothing but concentration. Whether they're touching something real or just the inside of their own skull remains the unanswered question. Let's return, one final time, to Pat Price, the windowless room at Stanford Research Institute. The piece of paper with coordinates, the impossible task of perceiving a Soviet installation he'd never seen, never heard of, couldn't possibly have known about. He closed his eyes and he described something: mountains, underground facilities, crane systems, steel spheres, details that matched classified satellite imagery, information that seemed to come from nowhere. Did he actually see it? Did his consciousness somehow extend across continents and perceive what was physically present in Kazakhstan? Or did he make educated guesses, read subtle cues from his interviewers, unconsciously process information he'd absorbed from news and culture and briefings, and happen to hit some details right while missing others? We don't know. The researchers believed him. The CIA was impressed enough to keep funding the work. His sessions were added to the evidence that something real was happening, and then he died. Heart attack, Las Vegas, 1975. The questions he raised died with him, or rather they kept living, unanswered decade after decade. After Pat Price, there were other viewers, other sessions, other apparent successes and documented failures. After Stargate, there were other programs, other investigations, other attempts to answer the question he'd raised. And after all of it, after 23 years and 20 million and thousands of sessions, and the collected efforts of scientists and spies and skeptics and believers, we still don't know. The question Pat Price posed with his closed eyes and his impossible descriptions remains open. Can consciousness perceive beyond its apparent limits? The universe has not answered. But here's what we do know. Real people spent years of their lives pursuing this question. Real people sat in windowless rooms, attempting to perceive the imperceptible, pushing their minds into territories that most humans never explore. Whether they were psychic or deluded, they were sincere. They believed they were serving their country. They believed they were exploring genuine capabilities of the human mind. They gave their time, their effort, their psychological health to a program that their government now dismisses as having had no operational value. Joe McMoneagle received a Legion of Merit and then watched his life's work be declared useless. Ingo Swann developed protocols that he believed revealed something fundamental about consciousness and then spent decades defending them against skeptics who called him a fraud. The women of the program, Angela De La Fiora Ford and the others, did the same work as the men and received less recognition. And Pat Price, the best of them by many accounts, died before the program really got started, leaving behind nothing but some transcripts and a mystery. History. These were people, not data points in a research program, not pawns in an intelligence game, people with families and hopes and fears and inner lives as complex as anyone's. They were used, deployed on missions, asked to perform something impossible over and over. And when the program ended, they were discarded, left to cope on their own with experiences that didn't fit any normal framework. Whether their abilities were real or not, their humanity was real, their suffering was real, their abandonment was real. That should count for something. So picture this: a windowless room, fluorescent lights humming, a table, 2 chairs, a piece of paper with numbers on it, someone sitting with their eyes closed, reaching out with their mind or believing they're reaching out, which may be the same thing, trying to perceive something far away. What do they see? Mountains, or the idea of mountains, or a hope shaped like mountains, or nothing at all, just the darkness behind closed eyelids, interpreted through desperation and self-deception. We don't know. The government spent 23 years trying to know, spent millions of dollars, used dozens of human subjects, ran hundreds of missions, and in the end, closed the file without a conclusion. Project Stargate didn't prove that psychic abilities exist, but it also didn't prove they don't. It left the question exactly where it found it, suspended in uncertainty. The door was opened. The researchers peered through. They thought they saw something, or wanted to see something, on the other side. And then the funding ran out, and the program ended, and the door was officially closed. But some doors, once opened, don't close completely. The viewers are still out there, teaching, writing, practicing, convinced they touched something real. The skeptics are still out there too, debunking, analyzing, convinced the whole thing was illusion. And between them, the question remains. Unanswered. Unanswerable, maybe. Can consciousness perceive beyond its limits? We may never know, and maybe that's the horror. Not a definitive answer, not proof that psychic powers are real, or proof that they're not, but the absence of any answer at all. 23 years, $20 million, and nothing but uncertainty to show for it. That's the legacy of Project Stargate. Not a revelation, just a question that won't go away. Here's what's certain. Our government has repeatedly explored has asked what the mind can do, what it can perceive, what it can be made to do. Sometimes in programs like Stargate, the exploration was relatively benign. Strange, yes, but not torturous. Sometimes in other programs, the exploration was monstrous. The pattern persists: secret programs, classified research, human subjects used for purposes they don't fully understand. The programs end or seem to end. The files are declassified or partially declassified. We learn fragments of what happened, and then the pattern repeats. New programs, new questions, new explorations of what the human mind can be made to do, somewhere, right now. Research is being conducted that we won't learn about for decades. Questions are being asked that the public isn't allowed to hear. Human beings are participating in experiments whose nature we can only guess. That's the real legacy of Project Stargate. Not the answer to whether psychic powers exist. We didn't get that answer. But the reminder that our institutions pursue questions in secret, use human beings to answer them, and discard those humans when the funding runs out. The remote viewers weren't weapons that worked, but they were treated like weapons to be tested. And somewhere, someone is still being tested. The door never really closed. Thank you for journeying into this strange corner of American history. Project Stargate remains one of the most unusual things the United States government has ever done. 23 years of psychic research, millions of dollars, real missions against real targets, and in the end, nothing but questions. If you found value in this exploration, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the Midnight Archives. Your support allows us to keep investigating the places where official history gets strange, where the comfortable narratives break down, where the truth, whatever it is, resists easy answers. Let me know in the comments. Do you believe remote viewing is possible? Have you ever experienced something you couldn't explain through normal perception? Where are you watching from and what time is it there? I'm genuinely curious because after researching this story, I'm not sure what I believe. The evidence doesn't support a clear conclusion either way, and maybe that's the most honest place to end up. In uncertainty, in openness, in willingness to admit we don't know everything about the universe or the mind, the government spent 23 years trying to answer whether consciousness can transcend its limits. They didn't find a definitive answer. Maybe there isn't one, or maybe the answer is classified in files that won't be released for another 50 years. Either way, the question remains. Till next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and remember that the strangest things about our world aren't always fiction. Sometimes they're just declassified.